Well, welcome back to 2022 and Decarb Connect's podcast. I can't believe it's actually nearly the end of January, and this is the first time that I'm sitting down in front of a microphone and a guest, but very happy to be here with Nick Fulford, who is Senior Director of Energy Transition at Gaffney Cline. So Nick, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks, Alex. Happy to be here.
And our kind of theme for today, we're going to sort of explore a few different things, but the core theme is what could drive North American industry to invest in net zero. And before we kind of dig into that specific question, let's do some scene setting. Maybe you could just explain a little bit about you and your background. The headline is a transplant from the UK in Houston. So you have that kind of interesting transatlantic perspective on a different market, a different country, but maybe you could tell us a little bit more.
Yeah, thanks, Alex. So, I'm very much a product of the UK for the first 40 odd years of my life. I kind of grew up with the sort of developments that British Gas followed through with the kind of global gas expansion and becoming very much kind of an international company. So a lot of my international experience was with them, and subsequently joining Gaffney Cline 8 years ago, it's given me a chance to travel even further afield and look at a number of very interesting projects around the world. So really, I suppose 2 to 3 years ago, it became clear that for the natural gas sector in particular, the sort of decarbonization and carbon intensity were becoming a bigger and bigger thing. And as a result, a lot of the advisory work that I've done with Gaffney Cline has sort of pivoted gradually towards the carbon side of things. And over the last 18 months, probably 80% of what I've done has been around various forms of decarbonization. To some extent, starting with the gas industry, particularly exports from LNG exports from the US, where carbon intensity has become so important, but more generally into the realms of other industries and looking at how to deal with carbon removal and sequestration or use. So it's been an interesting journey.
And for those, I think most people, certainly within oil and gas and the industrial sectors, know Gaffney Cline, but for our broader audience, what's the sweet spot of Gaffney Cline's focus these days? Obviously, you're right in the heart of their CCUS and carbon management program. Anything that you'd like to add about the lens that Gaffney Cline brings to this?
I think the way I would characterize Gaffney Cline is that there's about 75 of us globally. London's the biggest office, Houston, Singapore, and then here we have a big satellite office in Buenos Aires too. The company is populated quite heavily, people like me, spent a few decades in industry and quite experienced in looking at different things. So I think our sweet spot is the ability to look at projects, whether they be for a developer or indeed from a lender, and kind of home in fairly quickly on the sort of 6 things that might keep you awake at night. So it is that blend of kind of technical and commercial work and many years in the industry, which enables us to, I think, provide that kind of added value. And the other thing we do, which thankfully doesn't feature too strongly in the carbon world yet, is in the realms of expert testimony for disputes. So, as I say, contractually, the business models for carbon capture, sequestration, and so forth are in just developing. But in time, I'm sure this will be a feature too.
There's a lot of reasons why I was keen to have you on, but I definitely am interested in the view that you can have as a sort of cultural newbie when you move to especially a city like Houston, which is like the epicenter of all things energy in North America, certainly in the US. When you think about net zero and energy transition and decarbonization, all these phrases that get bandied about, what is it that you are seeing as a someone that has experience in both markets, Europe and North America? What are some of the differences that you're observing?
Yeah, well, that to me, that cultural difference and differences of approach is probably one of the biggest features of how people view things here. As you know, having lived so many years in the UK and Europe, where one is used to seeing references to climate change and decarbonization every day, you know, popping up in every realm of life, including the media, obviously. Here in the US, you don't have that sort of decades-long daily reminder of the importance of carbon and the carbon value chain going forwards. So, so from a starting point, people are looking at the challenges of carbon and climate change very differently here, without that sort of decades-long, you know, reminder that you know you get through the sort of societal pressures and dialogue. And the other feature of U.S. industry is, of course, it's very, very self-reliant. People rarely look to government for solutions. In fact, most companies and investors would actively avoid things which involve any kind of government involvement. Whereas, of course, in Europe, a lot of the decarbonization agenda is being driven by policy and support, which is true here to some extent as well. The other interesting feature here, I think, is this question of federal versus state. Because I think when I first became involved in the energy sector in the US, probably back in the 90s, it kind of surprised me how little federal policy really affected the kind of everyday energy investments on the state level, and the extent to which, you know, independent kind of state initiatives were actually much more important. So we're still in that realm today. For example, if you look at what California is doing, it's very, very different from many other parts of the US and arguably much further ahead. But equally, you know, some of the federal initiatives which are receiving, you know, quite a boost from the current administration are beginning to have an effect as well. And obviously one of the biggest of those is the 45Q tax incentives, which I'm sure we'll come back to talk about a bit more. So this kind of self-deterministic approach of rolling your sleeves up, you know, looking at what needs to happen to make a project work from a kind of sustainable investment perspective. It's, you know, it involves private equity, for example, you know, major lenders, project developers, that there is this kind of drive towards a sustainable economic framework, as opposed to looking at it from the point of view of subsidies and grants and that type of thing. Very, very different.
So it's interesting hearing you talk about those sort of differences culturally, the sort of the level of the kind of ongoing conversation, which you're right, we do get a lot more ongoing conversation about all things climate, I think, in UK and Europe. But one of the differences that I find interesting, or one of the observations I make that I find interesting, is that I associate the States and Canada and North America in general as being all about commercial opportunity. So it interests me that not only are we perhaps in a different place than you might think because of cultural and just general media differences in how things get discussed, but I still find it interesting that the commercial opportunity isn't something that has been pounced on more. You know, there's so much IP going to China, even Middle Eastern companies and all sorts of other national organizations around the world. I don't know if you have an observation on that or...
No, and maybe just to sort of clarify my earlier comments, I mean, part of that kind of self-reliance that I talked about is to do with, you know, creating a commercial money-making venture. And so it's very interesting if we look, you know, locally here in the Gulf Coast area. I think last time I counted up, there were about 30 CCUS projects being actively pursued. You know, everything from, you know, a small group of investors who found themselves with a depleted gas reservoir that they think is potentially useful for CO2, through to entities looking to build, carbon capture equipment adjacent to industrial plants. And I also mentioned the role of private equity. And a lot of what's happening at the moment in the US reminds me so much of the shale gas boom 10 years ago, where there was a kind of a germ of an idea which seemed like it had the potential to make money. And so, for those people who got in early and chose the right projects, they made a lot of money, they're very successful. And to some extent, I think the same is happening right now with carbon. That, there are a lot of projects out there. Many of them, frankly, probably have little prospect of getting further. But there's a very high degree of willingness at the moment to lend and to get involved and get a foot in the door. So I think for a lot of the financial institutions who are looking at this very commercially, there is a concern about being kind of left behind and left out. So projects that otherwise wouldn't see the light of day, I think, are being viewed very generously by the investment community because nobody quite knows yet where the sweet spot will be and the kind of project to invest in. So if you're a large New York-based capital fund, for example, with a multi-billion-dollar investment in energy infrastructure, then putting a few tens or hundreds of millions of dollars down into a project that still might need quite a bit of development and encouragement to become financially viable, it is still worth doing just for the experience.
Let's look into some more specifics. So if we think, certainly in Europe, one of the starting points has been a government-led approach, whether that's the EU or the UK or even the individual governments within the EU. What are you seeing in the US and Canada? What kind of approach is unfolding there? And to what extent do you think that is going to be the big driver?
Well, I think you'd have to just start a conversation off on the topic of 45Q, the IRS initiative, which provides a tax incentive of between $35 and $50 a ton for CO2 capture and use or sequestration. Much as it's not necessarily financially as significant as many would like, it is a very clear tax statute. You can read the regulations and determine what you have to do to get those funds. And it has been sufficient to provoke investments in some projects that otherwise wouldn't have seen the light of day. Basically, for any kind of capture-ready plant, such as ethylene oxide or ammonia, it's a kind of a no-brainer. Particularly if you can go the sequestration route and capture the full $50. So you can put a project together within that kind of $50 subsidy, if you like, which will provide a positive return. Once you get into more complicated projects like hydrogen or particularly power generation, or indeed heavy industry like cement or steel, that $35 to $50 remains an inadequate incentive to fully drive the financials. And that's one of the reasons why there are various bills going through Congress at the moment, which are seeking to up that potentially to around $85 a ton. So obviously, the further you push the tax incentive, the more carbon capture projects you can push into this kind of economically sustainable territory. But it has to be said that $85 is still insufficient to drive what I would call a kind of a widespread take-up of CCUS. And what's very interesting at the moment is that the projects that are seeing the light of day typically combine 45Q with something else, like, for example, the low carbon fuel standard credits in California. So this so-called stacking technique, where you can kind of mix and match different subsidies and economic benefits from different sources, is one area that is receiving a lot of attention at the moment. And coming back to our comments about culture, it's one of the things that US project developers are typically very good at. You know, it's the commercial structuring, it's complex tax partnerships and different types of transfer pricing to which essentially optimize the financials. And you know, that's very much been a feature of those projects that are beginning to see the FIDs currently. And some of the concepts that it's driving are very, very interesting. You know, using used chip fat from Europe to, you know, manufacture, you know, zero carbon aviation fuel in California. It's a kind of a value chain that you would have never have dreamt of, but it actually works because of the way the carbon industry is developing.
But am I right? I mean, I don't want, I'm definitely not an expert on 45Q, but some of the kind of early stage disruptors that we talk to, particularly those who are looking at CO2 reuse and arguably therefore sequestration of carbon in a solid form, 45Q doesn't work for them, does it? It works for large, kind of basically those large scale, you've got an old well, you shove it in the ground type projects. It doesn't apply, I believe, to all types of sequestration.
First point is that 45Q, even though I said you can read the regulation and establish what you need to do, it is long, it's complex, and there are various twists and turns to it, which mean that you know, you have to sort of work very hard to make sure you've ticked all the boxes. But what is true is that EOR is a well-established route for the CO2 capture, as is permanent geological sequestration. Those two carry currently, one carries up to $35 a ton tax credit, and the geological sequestration carries a $50 credit. One of the debates at the moment in the sort of US government circles is whether EOR should continue to attract a subsidy, in the sense that you're using the CO2, but you're producing another carbon intensive product as a result. But CO2 use in different forms is covered, but the credits are less than for geological sequestration. As I say, this is all sort of up in the air a little bit. As you probably know, and I'm sure as many of the listeners are aware, the Build Back Better bill, which is being debated in Congress right now, is the one with all the sort of carbon-related benefits and grants and incentives contained in it, as well as a lot of other government spending that is less than popular in some circles. You know, right now there's talk of sort of extracting those sort of carbon-related benefits and pursuing those through Congress, rather than this very, very broad spending bill, which is proving problematic. So all of that is kind of up for grabs right now. Luckily, I think the sort of common sense and the policy benefits of some of this decarbonization effort seems to be recognized, and I think there's an expectation that something will come out of Congress. We'll have to see what it is.
So you talked about the bill, you talked about 45Q, you mentioned LCFS. Are these things enough, or are you expecting to see kind of a lot more state by state incentives emerging, or do you think that's probably not the secret sauce of the future of all of this in the states or in the provinces of Canada? What's your gut feel?
Certainly, well, Canada has pursued a number of fiscal incentives recently, which have gone through to support CCUS. And of course, we shouldn't forget that this entire body of government policy and support, whether it be in the UK or the US or Canada or anywhere else, is generally perceived as a transitional means until there's a sustainable carbon price of some sort, which will essentially drive private capital to invest. But in terms of other incentives, certainly each state is looking at ways to decarbonize in different ways. It's kind of interesting to look at, Houston, very local example. It's a city which has owes much of its economic growth to oil and gas industry. It continues to be a major hub for oil and gas companies. Also has a growing kind of tech field, much of which is sort of focused around low carbon. And amongst many of the sort of key stakeholders in Houston, there is an awareness that Houston has enjoyed this decades-long period in history where it's been perceived as a leader in the energy industry. But to retain that leadership status, there is now a need very rapidly to refocus on delivering a net zero or low carbon agenda. And then so you turn yourself back and say, well, okay, even if Houston doesn't necessarily have a history of doing that, does it have the resources and the sort of ingredients necessary to do that? So you look at, Texas, Louisiana, and first of all, you just need to get in your car and drive a few miles from where I am now, and you will see a kind of an ocean of petrochemical facilities of different sorts, oil, gas processing, LNG, ammonia, hydrogen, you name it. So immediately we have this very big concentration of very high carbon emitting industry, not to mention, the harder to abate sources, like steel, cement and other industries which exist locally too. Then on the other hand, you've got one of the highest sort of global concentrations of hydrocarbon rich geology, some of which has been, all of which has been drilled, logged, well understood, vast amounts of data. And then particularly if you look to the near offshore Texas, Louisiana, you have an array of very carbon capture friendly saline aquifers, which present the opportunity to store thousands of gigatons of carbon. So in that sense, once you've captured the carbon, storing it is less of a challenge. So a lot of the focus in Texas, Louisiana is around the kind of regulatory features of making it easier for private companies to invest in carbon capture and sequestration, more so than the direct subsidies for the capture side. So there are a number of sort of structural advantages in certain parts of the US and Canada because of this, ironically, this very long history of oil and gas production, which equally creates a very fertile platform for a much different strategy around low carbon energy. So, from that point of view, if this kind of change of tack and this what in effect has been a very sudden kind of change for the oil and gas industry to have to accommodate, or indeed industry generally, if that change is properly reflected in the kind of leadership and both industrial and local and state government, then there's a really good strong platform to launch into low carbon industries in a relatively cost-effective and rapid way. But we'll see, because this part of the world doesn't have this long tradition of decarbonization, and I think there's a lot of sort of catching up to do in that area. But generally speaking, this kind of reliance on commercial measures, sustainable investment, that's what's going to carry the day, I think, more than large government-led initiatives.
Yeah, I think, even in Europe, where maybe, well, you know this, but to some people, it may look like in Europe government is going to be the driver of this. I still think actually the conversations we have with the industrials is much more about point us to the market for low carbon materials, we'll make them. Point us to the financiers of low carbon processes, and projects, and we'll do this. Those really seem to be, even in Europe, it really are the main drivers. It's more, as you say, that government is perhaps driving some more. In the UK, it's more about the kind of early innovation stage of some of the bigger projects. I really doubt that the UK government is going to be funding the BP Teesside ticket the whole way through.
No, yeah, and although frankly most of my sort of focus has been in this part of the world recently, looking at Europe is very different. Very interesting to see the different approaches, because the UK government has a strong record in kind of regulatory innovation, which they are applying, I think, quite effectively to the sort of carbon capture and sequestration value chain, and very clearly built around this kind of transitional mechanism to kind of lay the foundations for an industry that will be self-sustaining. So compare with Germany, for example, where there's been this kind of more belief-driven approach, in the sense that oil and gas is bad, whether it can be enhanced with carbon capture and sequestration or not. It's just not part of their strategy going forwards. So it is interesting how different governments are approaching things differently. And the UK seems to be quite a good halfway house, of getting the right incentives, but not necessarily choosing winners. Because this idea of government sort of choosing which technologies should be invested in is a real anathema to many people here, I think, where it's like, well, surely it should be the market that determines who wins and who loses. And that's very much part of this slight unease about too much government interference.
Okay, well let's take that commercial thread and then have a look at the business models that people are looking at here. We can talk a little more about CCUS in a moment, but I mean, there are other kind of business models or opportunities that people are starting to see come together. Again, if you were a betting man, what's your gut feel about what are those future core models going to look like, do you think? And again, let's focus in on US and Canada.
Well, one of the interesting developments over the last couple of years has been this perspective of heavy industry and how to address carbon removal, because it's very tempting to say, okay, well, we have a cement plant or a steel plant, we're producing huge amounts of CO2. Let's just send our exhaust gases next door to somebody who specializes in capture and then dealing with the CO2 in some fashion. And so a lot of those companies interested in capture plants and capture technologies and onward transportation and sequestration have approached a number of those sort of large emitters and said, well, okay, give us your exhaust and we'll deal with it. But the further you go down that dialogue, what you realize is that there's this kind of very symbiotic relationship operationally between, cement or steel production, for example, and the manner in which the capture plant adjacent deals with the CO2. So equally for the capture plant, any operational changes that affect the main industrial facility have a knock-on effect. So given the financial significance of the sort of primary industrial process and producing a product and selling it and making sure that those cash flows remain uninterrupted, the idea of sort of delegating carbon capture to a third party becomes less and less appealing, because the more you go down this route, the more you realize that these two operations are very, very interlinked. So what we're seeing, I think, is a preference for industrial emitters to essentially handle their own capture in a way that fits with their core business. But then what we are seeing is the development of a kind of aggregation, transportation, sequestration business model emerging from that. And then of course, we've got this very interesting contractual story which is emerging. So in the same way that natural gas production has take or pay, it has gas quality specifications, operating pressures, and a sort of contractual framework to make sure it all works properly. The same types of commercial agreements are starting to be entered into, between emitters and aggregators, between aggregators and storage facilities. And it's kind of early days, and there aren't really any kind of model contracts yet that we can look at. In fact, we're looking at kind of working on some of that at the moment. But this sort of coalescing of business model is just beginning to happen here and elsewhere. And interestingly, if you look at some of the again, if you look at some of the recent regulatory publications in the UK, they too are seeking to create a contractual framework around CO2 handling, which will start to deal with these, these key parameters and ensure that the sort of risk allocation between, the emitter and the aggregator and the storage, function correctly.
Just coming back to what the process industries and the hard to abate industries that we deal with, the main thing they say about CCUS, or most often say, is that without really understanding the full economics of capture to transport to storage, that there's no way for them to really make a big plan around that. It sounds very exciting. It could be great. They're maybe open to forms of CCUS as service, but there just aren't enough details around what the actual costs based on your location or type of emissions are going to be. Is that a long-term problem, or is that something you think actually that should become clear in the next 18 months? I don't know. What's your feeling on that?
Well, it's a great point, because the true sort of costs and complexities around carbon capture probably aren't well understood. And one of the most frequent challenges that we have as an advisory firm is that there probably is, or there has been, a kind of an industry-wide perception that carbon capture is a well-established technology, the costs are well understood, and it shouldn't be that hard to understand. But the truth is, that there's an array of different types of capture technologies available at different levels of technology readiness. There are promising technologies out there for which claims are being made in terms of the potential for significant cost reductions. But when you actually dig into them, they've been, rolled out successfully at a laboratory pilot level, but they just aren't industrialized. And another feature which often doesn't get fully recognized is the space requirements. If you look at the sort of layout of a typical large industrial facility, you might have a cogen plant, for example, which you would have thought would be a very sort of capture ready candidate, but it's it could be sandwiched in between several acres of heavy industrial plants and furnaces and kilns and what have you. So the practicalities of actually building a carbon capture plant to deal with the cogen are almost overwhelming. And another feature which can get overlooked is the energy intensity of carbon capture itself. So, you might be looking at a sort of a 10 to 15% reduction in power output from an industrial plant. once you've actually provided the energy for the amine plant or whatever it happens to be. So, so these things all add cost and complexity, and aren't necessarily things which you would sort of deal with up front. So I refer people to the National Petroleum Council study on CCUS. It was carried out probably nearly 3 years ago now, but it was a seminal work on CCUS costs and economics. And in fact, on our Gaffney Klein website, we're hosting a kind of cost estimation tool for that. But you know, that will only get you so far, and particularly for more complex industrial processes, this question of understanding the costs is a major hurdle which the industry is only now coming to terms with, I think.
Okay, and then so if we sort of look away from CCUS, then what are the kind of the next rung or the next opportunities that you see as being plausible business models of interest?
Although it's not entirely moving away from CCUS per se, you know, oxyfuels, very interesting technology. So instead of dealing with the CO2 after you've burnt whatever fuel you're looking at, essentially you put an air separation plant in advance of the power generation cycle, whatever it may be, and you essentially create a very pure, easily capturable stream of CO2 in the exhaust instead of the other way around. And it's one of those areas where those technologies have never really been given serious thought, because the need to capture carbon from a power generation cycle has never really been as high as it is today. So, you know, oxyfuels, various developments of sort of CO2 removal. And then, of course, you know, you have the whole other topic, which, you know, we probably don't have time to really touch upon today, of, you know, renewables and electricity storage. And one subject which interests me a lot because of my background in the gas industry is, of course, the transition towards a hydrogen economy, and whether that will be predominantly based on natural gas, for example, in the form of blue hydrogen, or whether it will be powered largely from renewables and electrolyzers in the form of green hydrogen. You know, there are various points of view on this. I think based on a sort of a cursory look at the industry and the technologies, one is very easily drawn down the route of green hydrogen. But as you begin to look at things in more detail, you know, blue hydrogen certainly has a lot to be said for it in certain parts of the world, particularly where there are plentiful supplies of low-cost natural gas. You know, from an industrial perspective, for particularly for some of the hard-to-abate industries like cement and steel, transitioning entirely to a hydrogen-based fuel obviously is arguably a quicker and much simpler way of dealing with the carbon footprint of the product, rather than dealing with CO2 as you're creating it in conventional technology. Main disadvantage, of course, it requires an entire redesign of your industrial process. And for plants that are on the drawing board today, it's, you know, perhaps a possibility, but for existing plants, it's not.
Well, so then the kind of, you touched on renewables there. The other thing that people are looking at a lot is the opportunity for electrification, full stop, which I guess then presents the question of, you know, is there enough clean power potential in North America to drive that? Is there an opportunity for more of the electricity grid, more of the power generation to become clean, to enable a clean electrification of industry? Do you see that as a reliable future bet?
Well, I mean, one of the interesting features of North America, and particularly the US, is that it has sort of quietly moved down the kind of renewables route. Texas, for example, is a huge wind producer. So, you know, these things have sort of quietly moved up the pecking order without a big fanfare. Obviously, for all these technologies, energy storage is absolutely the key. Certainly for the Texas grid is no different from any other in the sense that you've got this kind of critical period early in the mornings and early evenings where, without conventional generation, the renewables just simply cannot keep up with demand. So, innovative ways of energy storage, is definitely one of the sort of huge potential areas of change. At the moment, although, battery cost is going down quite significantly, there don't appear to be any kind of, knockout technologies out there, but who's to say that wouldn't change? But definitely for any industry, electrification has to be a trend which is going to take a bigger and bigger role. And of course, for the electricity supply industry itself, looking at probably a tripling of the electricity transmission and distribution infrastructure, you're talking trillions of dollars of investment, which is certainly outside the purview of our talk today, but represents a significant constraint on the move towards sort of deep electrification. But certainly, North America is interesting in the sense that power cuts and grid reliability here is nothing like what it is in Europe. People are used to quite regular power cuts. The infrastructure being above ground is more exposed to significant weather events, many of which we've seen here. And of course, that's, for any kind of energy consuming industry, coming back to the self-reliance point, that's why many of them have built their own cogen. They've got their power under control and don't have to rely on the grid for it.
So as a sort of slight, I guess, a wrap-up question or a wrap-up thought from you, is it a given that North American industry will decarbonize? Is it still a question in your mind as to whether it will? And what would ease its passage forward, do you think?
I think there's a simple answer to that question, and it's the market. Because, and I'll give you one little glimpse of how this can have an effect. So I think it was probably 2 years ago now, the French government vetoed an LNG export contract from one of the Gulf Coast exporters on the basis that the LNG was based on high carbon intensity shale gas development and so forth. And from a consulting point of view, what I noticed after that was a very sudden focus of all those management boards, right across all the sort of aspirational LNG exporters, a sudden realization that, well, if the customer is demanding a low carbon product, then we'd better get with the plan and provide one. So initially, the response to that was to look at nature-based offsets as a sort of very quick way of demonstrating to customers and financiers that they had a low carbon ready product on the books. It's had very wide ramifications to the types of LNG liquefaction technology that are being deployed. And then, as well as customer demand, the other feature which I think will drive a kind of inevitability about carbon reduction is finance. Because again, the LNG is a good example where if you don't have a capture ready strategy ready to show your investors, then frankly, you won't get any lending because so many financial institutions are now requiring it. So between customer demands and the constraints set by people providing finance, it's hard to see any other strategy but decarbonization.
Well, that's quite firm. I ask it really because it's not, I don't ask that as someone living in Europe looking to North America. Sometimes I wonder here even whether, yes, there's a lot of talk about decarbonization, but I don't know. Sometimes I feel like the undertow is not so different from the States or Canada, in that there are still these major obstacles to it becoming a reasonable business case, a reasonable market business case. So I think I do think it's inevitable in Europe, but perhaps not as straightforward as everyone might believe.
No, and I suppose, I stand by what I said in the sense that decarbonization is will have to happen. But the other side of the coin, which comes back to a number of things we discussed today, is this question of cost, because the costs are, I think, higher than perhaps the general public would be led to believe based on the sort of media reports that are written about the extraordinarily low cost of renewables and so forth. Once you put in sort of grid stability and interruptibility, the costs start to go up. So any meaningful removal of carbon from the energy value chain will have a high cost, and ultimately that will flow through to people's electricity prices, gas prices, and so forth. And in terms of what you just said there about the undertow, I think there's a certain amount of sticker shock that's going to happen over the next coming decades as the true cost of decarbonization starts to flow through.
Okay, well, Nick, thank you very much for joining me today. I'm looking forward to hosting you at our event in Houston in March. We're going to be talking about hubs and CCUS hubs there, which is obviously an interesting business model in Europe and an emerging one in the States as well. But thanks for joining us today.
Okay, well, thank you very much, Alex. Look forward to the event as well.
Many thanks for listening to the Decarb Connect podcast. We work with clients across the industrial sectors, specifically those who are tasked with decarbonising the most energy-intensive products and materials that we use every day. If you have an interest in learning more about either our members network, our reports, or our event series, do get in touch with us at decarbconnect.com. Or if you'd like to take part in the podcast, email me, alex@ac@decarbconnect.com. Thanks for listening.